Hi students, this week and from here on out in sociology class, we are going to be really heavily focused on those connections between the macro and the micro. I don't know how many times you've heard me say that this semester. There's a connection between macro level social forces and micro level life experiences, and that's really the basic definition of the sociological imagination. But all of the rest of the information that you're going to get this semester is going to be vital information that you need to bridge the gap between macro level understanding of society and micro level understanding of society or life experience on the you and me level. So I'm telling you this because one of our course learning outcomes is to develop and apply our sociological imaginations to current events or to everyday life in general. And Project 4 is going to be all about that. You might have seen an announcement in the week 12 folder that explains that you're going to have a project 4 and you're going to have two options to complete that. You're going to be able to look at the ascribed statuses of race, ethnicity, sex, and gender, or look at the social institutions that we're going to cover in this week, marriage and family and domestic partnerships and those kinds of patterns, and look at the macro scale part of society that affects those ideas and the micro scale part of society. But your job, and I do a lot of it in the videos for you, don't worry, the videos, the lessons that you're going to have, I'm going to, go over them carefully because as I'm explaining to you new content that you'll be quizzed over and then tested over during the final, I make this bridge. I bridge this gap and think of this bridge that I want to make in your thought process between macro and micro. Think of that as your sociological imagination. This is where the sociological imagination lies. It's the ability to make those connections, those informed connections, those critical thinking and synthesizing information from macro scale knowledge that you have to explain better and better understand micro scale experiences that either you have, that you witness in movies and books, that you see across the cul-de-sac from you, or that you read about, on Facebook or Instagram or watch on the news. So macro scale social facts, macro scale social norms, macro scale social institutions, and the ultra macro patterns such as I think I called it a mega macro pattern, patriarchy, when we covered that, which you can use those lectures on Project 4 if you want to opt for that particular part of Project 4 instead of the marriage and family part. So you have those two choices on Project 4. But anyway, there are some mega macro patterns like religious ideology. That's a mega macro pattern that can affect lots of different social institutions, social norms, and social facts in a society. Patriarchy is a mega macro pattern. Matriarchy would be a mega macro pattern if we lived, in a matriarchy. There are a few of those around the world. And all of those ultra or mega macro patterns affect how the social institutions in society are formed, affect the social norms and what we think of as correct and on the right pathway, or what we think of as deviant, and perhaps learn what deviance is in our socialization process. And then the social facts, that's our patterned way of thinking, feeling, and acting that affects society as a whole, but also controls our behavior. It sets the definition for norms, and it sets the definition of deviant behavior or non-deviant behavior. So, gosh, just in this last 5 minutes, when I've been talking about this, I have covered so many different topics from the very beginning of the semester until now, because that's what your sociological imagination is all about. That's what critical thinking is all about. Taking different pieces of information about topics that don't necessarily seem like they are related to each other, but they are related to each other if you put your thinking cap on and you examine them critically to see the connections, and you synthesize information from the socialization chapter to the social stratification chapter to the marriage and family chapter. So this week we're going to focus heavily on chapter 11, the marriage and family chapter, and you're going to see a lot of review about how we learn in our socialization process to repeat the same pattern of the socioeconomic level that we experience experience growing up. Some of you texted me or wrote to me about the Lolly's Kin documentary that I asked you to watch and said, my goodness, how can this be relative poverty instead of absolute poverty? And how is it not a human development issue because the education level is so low? And so I had some really good conversation and interaction with y'all about that. But those kids are just learning the way that Lolly learned and the way that she learned from her folks. And it's just a repeated pattern. And so we can kind of get stuck in generational poverty based on the family unit that we are born into. So it's not just about our socialization process and other agents of socialization like the mass media or like school, because if I pull you out of school in the 5th grade and don't send you back, then you don't have that agent of socialization. If we don't have electricity in our household because we live in relative poverty, then we certainly don't have Netflix or an antenna to put on our TV or something like that so you can see other examples other than our own through the mass media or something like that. If I don't have a good education level, if I dropped out in the 5th grade, I can't read you a bedtime story and you're not going to learn how to read either. So these kinds of things are very, very important for our life chances. And you've got to be able to, as a thinking college level student as you are, you've got to be able to see those connections, and not just about sociology in this class, but in all of your classes, right? Your philosophy classes and history classes and math classes, even biology even. Some of the best innovations and discoveries have occurred because people asked questions. People asked those questions that bridged the gap between, I think I know this stuff, so is this stuff true? You have to ask those questions. Okay, so remember this bridging the gap. If I have a social fact that is a pattern way of thinking, feeling, and acting, well, then my personal feelings and attitudes and beliefs and ideas aren't just unique to myself. My caregivers during my socialization process didn't just weave them out of thin air into whole cloth. They were affected in my socialization process. I got those personal feelings, ideas, and beliefs from the agents of socialization that created interaction for me through which I learned my pattern. Social norms, my personal behaviors. Do I fit the mold of acceptability that society defines on a macro scale? Or am I deviant by label because society on a macro scale says that my personal behaviors don't fit that standard dominant ideology acceptable norm? Social institutions, marriage and family is what this is about. Religion is what our next chapter is going to be about. Then education, we'll close out the semester with the education system. We'll look at these different social institutions. We'll look at economics. We have looked at social stratification. We've looked at so many different social institutions and how they connect to create expectations for how we are going to live our lives, what we are going to do and be. Why are you in school with me right now? I promise, even if you've enjoyed the class, like some of you have told me you have, I promise it's not because you just want to hear me talk. It's because you have to do this to get the degree that you want. Otherwise, you wouldn't be putting up with me right now, and I know it. So do you. So you're living up to expectations. Whose expectations? Mom and dad's? Maybe. Society? Definitely, because you're not going to get that job unless you have that credential behind your name. So also those ultra macro patterns, if you're female or you have any ascribed status that makes you different than the most dominant group in society, you've got obstacles in your way, whether you know it or not, and whether the other people around you in different categories of people than you know it or not. So think constantly while you're watching the videos in this week's lesson and review in your mind all the videos, all the lessons that we've had up to this point, because bridging this gap between macro and micro is what you're required to do at this point with all this knowledge you've got. So please, watch all the rest of these videos with that in mind. Take your notes with that in mind. Pause the video and jot down your ideas with that in mind so that you're just working your brain out, just like you get on the treadmill and run, or any other exercise that you do for any other muscle. Exercise that gorgeous brain of yours. Okay, so text me with questions. Bye.